Joined now by Edwin F. Ackerman, professor at Syracuse University, whose piece in New Left Review is entitled The AMLO Project. Edwin, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Edwin, let's start at base level here for large American audience. Might not be, some people might be watching from Mexico, but who is AMLO? Andrés Manuel López Obrador, I guess is how you say the full name. And how did he rise to power in 2018? He's about to be term limited out in 2024. So but a president who has been definitely left of center, and I think a lot of people view him as a leftist success story.
Right. He has obviously a very long political history. He's been a sort of staple of Mexican politics, I would say, since at the very least the year 2000, depending on how you're counting. That's when he became mayor of Mexico City. And he's ran for the presidency 3 times, winning the third time, and has always, in one way or another, sort of flown the flag of anti-neoliberalism, or critiques at the very least of the neoliberal turn. I think that would be the sort of more consistent element throughout the years that has identified him. The victory in 2018 was a rupturous moment. It came after 2 very difficult runs, one in particular in 2006, in which he claimed, at least from his perspective, that there had been fraud. And by the time that he won in 2018, there had been a significant crisis of representation with all the mainstream parties of the period. So he won by really big margins. So from the beginning of his presidency in 2018, he's had a significant amount of let's say, political capital or legitimacy that he's maintained or worked with throughout his tenure.
And he's maintained a very high popularity rating within Mexico. And when he did win in 2018, he had like a massive lead over his closest contender. And he's basically essentially maintained a popularity throughout his entire presidency.
Yeah, he has. I mean, if you so yes, in the actual victory of 2018, he won by 30 points in a 4-way race. So that's
wow.
A gigantic margin. And he's maintained the popularity at around the mid-60s, depending on how you're counting, if you average it out. Now, there's some interesting sort of elements to that trajectory, because it hasn't been exactly at that level throughout the years. There was, for example, a significant dip at the very beginning of the pandemic. So in the summer of 2020, for example, that was his lowest point. So part of the story is, yes, on the one hand, retaining that level of support, but also coming back from that dip during the summer of 2020 when the pandemic started.
His party, MORENA, he founded it, if I'm not mistaken, right? What's the party's history? What are the planks of the party, and what's its future post AMLO?
Right. So it's a very recent party, founded in 2014 as a party. It existed as a type of social movement organization before that. AMLO himself, as I was saying, has this long political history. He began in his first experience with party politics was as a member of the PRI, which, for people who might not be familiar with, is a party that stayed in power in Mexico throughout most of the 20th century. Was a party that was the heir of a revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. Over the course of the years, becomes authoritarian, and eventually also presides over the neoliberal turn. But during most of the 20th century, it essentially presided over a mixed economy, a Keynesian economy. And it's in that period in the 70s in which AMLO, as a 20-something-year-old, joins that party. That party was then going to have a significant split to the left. Its left flank broke off in the late 80s, precisely as the party leadership was making a full conversion into neoliberalism. The break in the 80s produced a party called the PRD that is still around, even though it's a sort of tiny little party. That's where AMLO really comes to the center stage at the national level. He becomes mayor of Mexico City under that party. He breaks from that party in 2012, 2013, as the party tries to move to the center under a label that party leaders at that period called responsible left, quote unquote, which meant basically signaling that they were not radicals, that they were willing to compromise with the neoliberal center, etc. He breaks with them in 2012, forms this organization that would later become a party. So it's a very new organization. In fact, many of its sort of institutional elements in terms of rules, internal rules of operation, how to choose a successor. That's one of the big issues that's going on as we speak. Party leadership, all of that is really sort of in flux. It's an organization that had a few years of existence before it suddenly found itself at the helm of state power. And again, if we're gonna think about it ideologically, if you look at its program, essentially it's basically a nationalist, developmentalist, anti-neoliberal or post-neoliberal, depending on how precise you want to be with these terms, organization. Now, at the same time, I should say that there is, partly because it's such a new organization that also entered into state power so quickly, there is a significant amount of difference or lack of cohesion of what the organization is. It's particularly at sub-regional and local levels. So there's a big batch of people who win local positions in 2018, partly sort of under the wings of the huge victory of AMLO. And there at the local or sub-regional level, again, it becomes ideologically much more fragmented, right? So
Gotcha.
That's important to say as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's just, I guess, talk about some of the successes of AMLO's time in office. And he came into office, as you say, trying to beat back neoliberalism and bring in like a new era. There were pro-worker reforms that had a lot of effect, is my understanding. What were some of those? What were some of the bolstering of social programs that he presided over?
Right. I think there's been a huge sort of advance of pro-worker reforms. I mean, we can get into some of them. The list is a long list. Off the top of my head, I can mention the institution of formal rights for domestic workers, for the first time in the country's history. The elimination of a hiring practice called outsourcing, that allowed employers to evade all sorts of otherwise legally mandated bonuses that they would have to give to their employees. This could be easily skirted by outsourcing, quote unquote, the hires. There's been historic increase to the minimum wage, increase of mandated vacation days. The work week is in the process of being lowered. It's currently at 48. It's going to be lowered to 40. Those are just some of the reforms that come to mind. A very important one is labor reform that dramatically facilitates the possibility of forming new unions, something that was really difficult to do before this.
And how has the working class or even the middle class responded to this?
Right.
I mean, has that support manifested itself in polling and in like other races for his party?
Right. Yeah, that's a really important point, I think, because there is an interesting thing that happened to the sort of social base of his party or of support that's different from the social base that put him in power in 2018. In 2018, the working class vote was sort of scattered around the different parties. In other words, there was really no working class vote per se as a bloc. They were just sort of, to the extent that they were part of the political process, were absorbed by other sorts of parties, including the neoliberal bloc. And interestingly, even AMLO's 2018 victory was partly with the support of the credentialed middle classes, sort of university trained sectors. Right? Over the course of his presidency, there's been this transition in the change in the base, in the composition of the base, where it's become a much more working class popular base, and the credentialed middle class faction sectors have some, at least, not all, but some at least have abandoned their support for him. So you have this transformation of the underlying social base of the party, and I think the growth of support from the working classes, the informal sector, which is is very important sector in the country, in fact, might be the majority of the country, depending on how you're counting it. So the working class in the classic sense, the informal sector, and the peasantry, the countryside, those are the real bastions of support in the present. And the business sector, not surprisingly, and perhaps surprisingly, credentialed middle classes are on the other end. Right? They represent the growing opposition.
Well, and in terms of the opposition, like, how has the business sector responded to some of these reforms?
Right. There is, of course, a big backlash from the business sector. And one of the interesting developments over the past years is the degree to which the business sector has come out on the public sphere to openly organize the opposition. So partly as an effect of the huge margin of victory in 2018, all the other parties that had dominated politics throughout the neoliberal period were suddenly, reduced to tiny parties. And they have had to form a coalition. Parties that historically were supposedly, against each other, are now running as a coalition. That's their only chance of winning. But that coalition requires, obviously, a huge amount of coordination, of money, of talking points, of agreements to concede positions or spoils between the different factions of the coalition. And it's quite interesting that it's been the business sector, again, that has to openly step into the public sphere, as opposed to move just simply behind closed doors to organize the opposition. So that's the current state, I guess, of the opposition. They are, I think, when they are put together, they do, particularly in some areas, are within reach of winning. Right? But in general, I think they are pretty weakened. They are really reactive to the president's agenda. They haven't been able really to set any agenda items produced within them. So the success of the backlash, I guess, is quite limited at this point.
Well, I mean, that's good. Good to hear. Yeah. I'm curious because there's been some characterization of AMLO in the press in the United States, like the New York Times, that he has authoritarian tendencies, and I know he's been like fairly militant and obsequious to Trump and Biden in terms of border policy. Right. What's your assessment of those criticisms?
Right. I mean, I think I don't agree with with those particular criticisms. There are other things actually that I personally would criticize and would be happy to talk about them if you want. But in particular, those elements, particularly the question of authoritarianism, I think is a real mistake. And I would say, that, speaking to U.S.-based audience, that we should read these accounts of AMLO in the liberal press, like the New York Times, with the same level of consciousness or suspicion that we did when they were covering the Bernie Sanders campaign, for example, which is they do have a particular agenda, even if it's unstated. It's a liberal agenda, not conservative, but it also means they do have a gripe against left-wing populism. And so that is, the sort of general framing or bias of most of the coverage. Not only outside, I would throw in Mexican media, mainstream media at least, there as well. So basically, to put it in short, when I read the New York Times coverage of AMLO, I am basically reading transcripts of opposition talking points. Like it's basically a one-to-one. And this, could get into this, why this happens, but I think it has to do with the particular networks that, intellectual networks that, overlap between New York Times and Mexican media, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of a through line, frankly, for Latin American coverage in institutions as well, like the Washington Post and the New York Times. I mean,
Yeah.
like how they covered Venezuela is a great example, or Bolivia. You see those kinds of they're very susceptible to that kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So just to, for example, use an example of an instance in which that was sort of framed as authoritarian. There is this ongoing back and forth between AMLO and the former head of the Electoral Institute, the institute in the country in charge of organizing elections. Right? So from a kind of simple perspective, the fact that the head of the executive, that AMLO, is criticizing the head of the National Electoral Board looks bad, looks authoritarian. Of course, it's missing all sorts of context and history about what specifically the Electoral Institute has done, how it has operated, and the specifics of the tenure of that particular head of the Electoral Institute, who, just to throw a couple of examples, a couple of years ago, already into the AMLO presidency, was using the Electoral Institute platform to give lectures against the perils of populism. This is the head of the Electoral Institute, the head of the head of the organization in charge of organizing elections, lecturing about the perils of a movement, without naming in particular a party or a leader, but we all understand, what he's referring to.
Yeah.
Now that is a clear breach of the neutrality that a judge, that a referee of elections should have. So, and that's just one example of growing tension between that person and AMLO that became increasingly public, and the opposition was successful at sort of rallying around the flag of defense of institutions against the populist authoritarian. And again, that's what I mean by oftentimes publications such as the New York Times really just picking up uncritically talking points of the opposition.
In terms of the more substantive criticisms that you hinted at earlier, what would you list?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, well, you did mention the question of the relationship to the U.S. government
along the border. Yeah.
The border, yes. I mean, I think there's no real way around the fact that there's been a sort of dismal record of defense of the rights of Central American migrants. Obviously, the situation, the case is very complex, has many sides or sort of levels of difficulty to it. I'm not, trying to be sort of simplistic about it, but at the end of the day, the AMLO administration has basically acquiesced with the request by the U.S. government, which again is not just Trump, includes Biden, and it presided to Trump as well, to secure the southern border, to prevent Central American migrants from going through the country and reaching the northern border. And the ways of preventing this have not exclusively, but significantly included the use of force. Right? Not exclusively. There's also been an offering of Mexican visas and other sort of attempts to deal with the request or demand of the U.S. to kind of to placate the border. So I think there is a sort of forfeiting of sovereignty on that front that that has happened. I think the other element that I would bring up here is his relationship to feminism. AMLO's relationship to feminism, which has been a sort of complex one as well. On the one hand, he sort of is proud to boast that he has a cabinet conformed of 50% men and women. This is a explicit self imposed policy of his government, right? To have gender parity in big appointments of that sort. But at the same time, there has been this very important and very militant movement of women and feminists, street mobilizations, particularly around the question of femicides, right? Which is an issue, obviously, that precedes AMLO, but continues into his presidency. And he's really wavered about how to position himself in relation to that movement. I think his initial reaction was more interested in unmasking it as a plot by the right wing, partly because sectors of the right wing have tried to sort of hijack or jump on that front, right, as a way of just kind of attacking the government, but missing the fact that in its core and in its bulk, the movement is a real movement, not a front for the right wing. So has been sort of ambivalent about how to work with the demands of the movement, and has been, for example, critical of what in the U.S. is called direct action tactics, so sort of sort of rioting elements of the tactics in ways that come off as condescending or even some degree tone deaf in relation to the severity of what the movement is pointing to, right? This persistence of femicides. So to focus on the methods of protest as opposed to the significance of the demand has been, I think, a problem.
I mean, well said. That's very helpful to understand. Last question for you, Edwin, before I let you go. How does AMLO and his legacy fit into the larger resurgence of left-wing movements that we're seeing, I mean, in the Americas, but really in Latin America right now? Right.
I think, as we start to think about the legacy of AMLO for the left, there's three things that I think immediately come to mind. Two that have to do with the particular phase of neoliberalism in which we're in, which is one in which there's been a significant fragmentation and weakening of the working classes as a political agent. And second, this process of hollowing out of the state capacity. So in that context, in the context of, let's say, the sort of decimation of neoliberalism on that front, I think the legacy is a revamping of class politics, right? At least an initial revamping of class politics, and revamping of the power of the state, right? Now, I would say a third element here, which I think is one of the sort of, let's say, unique elements of the government, at least in sort of the comparative historical perspective with other Latin American left governments or with populist movements of the West more broadly, which is the particular conception of corruption as neoliberalism, or the link between neoliberalism and corruption. What's, I think, unique here is that whenever, in previous instances, in the country or in Latin America more broadly, in previous instances in which corruption has been taken up as a source of organizing or a political issue, it usually tends to be a right-wing demand that basically calls for a contraction of the state. It is implied that it's an anti-statist sort of demand. What's unique here is the use of an anti-corruption message or platform in the service of advancing the interest of the left, and in fact of regenerating the legitimacy of the state. So those would be the three elements that I would think about in terms of a legacy for the left.
Well, really appreciate your time today. Edwin F. Ackerman, professor at Syracuse University. The piece in New Left Review is entitled The AMLO Project. Edwin, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Emma.
For sure.